Okay, let's unpack this. We've just come off one of the absolute highest points of theological teaching anywhere in the Bible.
Absolutely. Paul, in Galatians chapter 4, verses 1 through 7, he has just declared, without any ambiguity, that believers are no longer slaves. We're full, adopted, adult sons and heirs of God.
It's a stunning, glorious legal declaration.
It really is. It's the ultimate statement of our objective security in Christ. The sonship is a done deal, the inheritance is guaranteed, and that whole guardianship of the law, it's over.
But if you read verse 7, which ends on that triumphant, almost a shout of freedom, and then you move straight into verse 8, the whole atmosphere doesn't just change, it violently shifts.
The bottom completely falls out. It's a gut punch.
Yeah. The tone goes from these lofty legal facts of grace to this deep, gut-wrenching sorrow, like a parent whose child has willingly chosen to go back to poverty.
And that's exactly where we're going. We are now entering one of the New Testament's most intense, most personal pastoral appeals. Paul is addressing what you can only call the tragedy of regression.
The irony is just staggering. So our mission in this deep dive is to really get into the immense emotional and, of course, the theological weight of verses 8 through 20.
Because Paul, he completely changes hats here. He stops being the stern logician, the systematic theologian, and he becomes this anguished mother in labor.
And he's trying to process this central, heartbreaking question of the whole letter.
Exactly. Why? Why, after receiving this staggering freedom, the status of a full heir, the promise of the Spirit, why would these believers voluntarily choose to return to the slave quarters?
That tension, that contrast between glorious freedom and voluntary bondage, it forces you to reevaluate what we even mean by security and freedom.
It's hard to imagine, but Paul is about to prove they are absolutely doing it.
So let's start right where Paul starts, with his blunt reminder of their past lives in verse 8. He opens by forcing the Galatians to remember who they were before Christ. He says, "Howbeit then, when ye knew not God, ye did service unto them which by nature are no gods."
This is such a powerful anchoring statement. And we have to remember, the Galatians were primarily Gentiles.
Right.
Their background wasn't the Mosaic Law, which was, a difficult tutor, but at least a structured one. Their pre-conversion life was, as Paul says in Ephesians, just total darkness. They were without God in the world.
And he characterizes their past life not as some kind of hobby, but as doing service.
Yeah.
We often just breeze past that phrase, but the Greek word he uses, edulisate. That's a heavy word?
It's a very heavy word. It means they were literally enslaved.
Wow.
Yeah, it implies a condition of servitude, of lacking any self-determination. They weren't just, engaging in some religious practices on the side. They were bound to them.
And what were they bound to?
Entities that by nature are no gods. And this is where Paul gets into a really rich theological conversation with just immense skill.
Okay, break that down for us. How so?
Well, Paul is engaging with two very distinct philosophical traditions about idols. On the one hand, he's affirming the sophisticated Jewish view that idols are, they're non-entities.
They're just wood and stone.
Exactly. They're inert. As he writes elsewhere, an idol is nothing in the world. Wood, stone, metal. They have no inherent power, no divinity.
Okay, so if the idols themselves are nothing, why was the servitude so crushing?
Because of the second theological position, which deals with the reality behind the worship. While the physical idol is inert, Paul and Jewish tradition were very clear that the worship offered to these non-gods is often received, or you could say intercepted, by very real demonic or spiritual realities. So the Galatians, living in that Hellenistic world, they were enslaved to fear, to appeasement, and just sheer capriciousness. They believed that local spirits, the spirits of the harvest, or the astral forces, that these things controlled their destiny, their weather, their health.
So their entire lives just revolved around managing and appeasing these terrifying, unreliable forces.
Correct. Their bondage was to a lie, and they were terrorized by these external, capricious forces they had to constantly manage through ritual and sacrifice. Paul is reminding them, you were slaves to an oppressive, spiritually bankrupt system.
And that context is so essential because it makes the very next statement, where he describes their rescue, utterly shocking.
It really does.
The description of their transformation in verse 9, it's just beautiful. Paul starts, "But now, after that, ye have known God."
But he stops. He pauses right there, and this is where we see the theological heart of the entire book of Galatians just distilled into a single profound rhetorical move, a self-correction, a correctio.
He refines his statement.
Immediately, he says, or rather, are known of God.
That pivot, that little shift from the active we know to the passive we are known. That's monumental. We really need to linger here. What is the profound theological implication of that slight change in voice?
It shifts the entire ground of our salvation from human effort to divine initiative. I mean, think about it. If our security, our adoption, our status as sons, if it all depended on our knowing, on our fragile cognitive grasp, our fickle emotions, or our ability to maintain some perfect standard.
It would be a terribly fragile temporary thing. Our hold on God can be so weak.
Exactly. If the whole structure rests on my knowing God, then my performance has to be flawless to keep that knowledge intact.
Which is impossible.
Impossible. But by pivoting to the passive voice, our known of God, Paul grounds their entire existence in God's election, his intimate knowledge, and his unwavering intention.
So the security isn't tied to the Galatians' strength or memory.
Not at all. It is tethered to God's powerful initiating action. It's God who started the relationship. He selected them, he called them, he claimed them.
This makes me think of Jesus' statement in John chapter 15, "You did not choose me, but I chose you."
It's the exact same profound assurance. And this deep foundational certainty is what makes their regression a cosmic absurdity.
Right. Why would you strive for acceptance or approval through burdensome external rituals when the creator of the universe has already intimately known you, selected you, and adopted you?
Once you are known by God, striving for human or ritualistic approval is just a nonsensical act. It's self-condemnation.
And that absurdity then frames the core theological problem Paul has to address. He asks in verse 9, "How turn ye again to the weak and beggarly elements, whereunto ye desire again to be in bondage?"
That phrase, weak and beggarly elements, or stoicheia in the Greek, that is the interpretive key to this entire section. If we misunderstand stoicheia, we're going to misunderstand Paul's whole argument against the Judaizers.
Okay, so lay out the prevailing interpretations of stoicheia for us, because it seems like Paul is using it in a really unique, synthesizing way.
He is. So historically, the term stoicheia had two very strong meanings. First, in common classical Greek, it referred to things in a row, or elements that form a sequence, like the letters of the alphabet.
The ABCs.
Exactly. This is what we'd call the basic principles view. In this context, the law and its observances are simply the elementary instructions, the kindergarten, or the ABCs of religion. They were suited for spiritual infants, the period before Christ arrived.
So spiritual regression is literally just returning to elementary school when you should be in university.
Precisely. They are moving backward to basic foundational lessons instead of embracing the maturity that comes with grace.
Okay, and the second view.
The second major view is the elemental spirits view, and this was rooted very deeply in Hellenistic philosophy and Gnostic thinking, where Stoicheia referred to astral powers, spiritual forces associated with the physical elements, earth, air, fire, water, and the movements of the sun, moon, and planets.
And that second view connects directly back to the pagan idolatry Paul just mentioned in verse 8, being enslaved to nature's spirits and cosmic cycles.
It creates a perfect theological loop. And this is where Paul's genius just shines, because regardless of whether the Galatians were primarily thinking about the Jewish law as rudimentary principles or as being manipulated by spiritual forces, Paul performs a shocking theological synthesis.
The synthesis being that he equates the legalistic observance of the divine Mosaic law with their former fearful pagan idolatry.
He says they are fundamentally the same system.
Now that sounds jarring. I mean, are we really suggesting that the divine law, given by God at Sinai, is morally equivalent to terrorizing nature spirits? Isn't that a dangerous theological jump?
And that's the challenge. The difference isn't in the law's original intent, but in its legalistic application. Paul is always clear. The law itself is holy, just, and good.
Right.
However, when the law is interpreted by the Judaizers and then accepted by the Galatians as a means of justification and acceptance, as a way to prove their worth to God, it ceases to be a tutor leading to Christ. It becomes just another external, performance-based demand.
Okay, so what is the common denominator between ritualistic paganism and this kind of ritualistic Judaism?
The common operational principle is human achievement. Both systems demand that the devotee manipulate external factors, whether it's offering sacrifices to a harvest god or rigorous adherence to a Sabbath day, to attain or maintain divine favor. Both systems are inherently performance-driven.
So in this sense, trading Christ for the law isn't an upgrade from paganism at all.
No, it is simply a lateral move back into the exact same world system of performance anxiety and self-justification.
So when the Galatians adopt circumcision in the calendar, they're essentially just replacing one set of performance rituals with another. They're substituting external management for internal transformation by grace.
And that's why Paul describes these elements as weak and beggarly. They're weak because they're powerless to save or to truly sanctify anyone. They cannot confer the Spirit.
And beggarly.
Because they're spiritually bankrupt. They offer no lasting inheritance, no real spiritual wealth-only debts that can never be repaid. You exchanged an infinite eternal inheritance for a stack of useless IOUs. That's why it's so absurd.
And if you look at the modern application, I mean, we see this constantly. Where do we see this performance-based achievement substituting for grace today?
Oh, absolutely. Everywhere the church adopts a mechanism for earning status, whether it's through hyper-intense activism where your words are justified by your political or social engagement.
Or even spiritual disciplines that become a checklist for super Christian status.
Exactly. Or a subtle reliance on social media Christianity, where acceptance is tied to projecting a perfect performative image. If the goal is anxiety reduction or justification through your own effort, it is Stoicheia in modern dress. It is a return to the lie that says, what I do determines who I am.
Okay, so the theoretical absurdity is now crystal clear. But Paul needs to prove that this regression is actually happening. He has to move from the abstract danger to the concrete, damaging evidence.
Right, and he points directly to their practices in verse 10. Ye observe days and months and times and years.
This is so crucial because it shows the Galatians weren't just debating theology in a classroom. They were actively implementing a new, restrictive liturgical calendar under the guidance of these Judaizers.
That's right. And the verb Paul uses, ye observe, paraterist, implies a scrupulous, almost obsessive adherence. They're watching these days closely as if their spiritual standing depended on perfect scheduling.
This wasn't just a casual remembrance. It was a religious burden they were willingly taking on. So walk us through these 4 categories of observance.
Sure. These 4 terms, they map perfectly onto the required liturgical calendar of the Old Covenant, which really defined Jewish identity. The days refer first and foremost to the weekly Sabbath observance.
The rigorous stopping of work on Saturday.
Yes, which was the ultimate sign of the covenant between God and Israel. And the Judaizers were enforcing this Sabbath rest as mandatory for Gentile Christians.
Okay, what's next?
Next, the months refer to the important new moon festivals. These were significant liturgical events, often marked by trumpets, special offerings, and a temporary rest from labor. You can read about it in Numbers chapter 28, verse 11.
These observances really serve to anchor the life of an old covenant believer in a predictable, God-ordained cycle.
Absolutely. Then you have the times, which specifically refers to the 3 major pilgrimage festivals, the great seasonal feasts, Passover, celebrating national redemption, Pentecost, celebrating the harvest and the giving of the law, and Tabernacles, celebrating God's provision in the wilderness.
And finally, the years.
The years would have encompassed the long cycles, specifically the sabbatical year, where the land rested every 7 years, or even the year of Jubilee happening every 50 years, which was designed to restore people and property to their original state.
So this is not a small checklist. This is a comprehensive liturgical yoke.
It is. Paul is saying, you have voluntarily decided to put yourselves back under the ceremonial law, the very law which Christ fulfilled and set aside.
But again, we need to be really clear on the pastoral reflection here. Is Paul forbidding all Christian observation of special days? I mean, should we, for instance, discard days like Christmas or Easter?
No, not at all. And that's a key distinction. Paul is not condemning celebration or the remembrance of historical events. He actually addresses this nuance elsewhere, particularly in Romans chapter 14, where he says we should be fully persuaded in our own minds regarding which days we observe.
So what exactly is he condemning here in Galatians?
He is condemning the reliance on the observance of these days as a requirement for justification or as a measure of spiritual maturity. The moment an observance shifts from being a celebration of Christ's finished work to being a prerequisite for divine or community acceptance, it has become Stoicheia.
A beggarly element.
Exactly. They were returning to the shadows, treating Christ like he was just a temporary means to get back under external religious requirements.
It's the difference between celebrating the freedom you already possess and trying to earn freedom through a mandatory checklist. That's a devastating diagnosis.
And that diagnosis leads directly to the sheer emotional weight of verse 11, where Paul expresses his deep vulnerability. I am afraid of you, lest I have bestowed upon you labor in vain.
This is a remarkable admission for an apostle. It's fear for them, a fear of tragedy. And that word for labor, kopiao, That sounds incredibly intense.
Oh, it is. Ecopia was not the word for simple, enjoyable work. It implies toil to the point of utter exhaustion, to the point where you would collapse from the effort. It reflects the intensity, the sheer emotional and physical sacrifice Paul invested in establishing them in this radical gospel of grace. He poured his life out for them, enduring persecution, long journeys, physical pain, all for them.
So when he says that this immense effort might be in vain, that phrase carries enormous theological weight, especially when you think about the security of the believer. What are the stakes here?
This requires some theological precision. Given the absolute declaration of sonship back in verses 6 and 7, it's not likely that Paul is worried they're going to lose their justification, their initial salvation granted by faith.
That promise is objective and absolute, right? It's grounded in God's knowing them.
Exactly.
So if he's not worried about their ticket to heaven, what loss is he afraid of?
He fears the loss of their spiritual profit. If a believer reverts to legalism, the central transformative process of the Christian life is entirely derailed. Their spiritual growth is stunted.
His goal was never just conversion.
Never. It was their maturity to see Christ formed in them, which he states explicitly later in verse 19. If they stop maturing and they stay stuck in the kindergarten of rules and rituals, all of Paul's agonizing effort aimed at their maturity has been functionally futile.
So the tragedy is that they are forfeiting the full privileges of sonship. They're choosing to behave like slaves when they are, in fact, free heirs.
Yes, they are trying to earn what they already fully possess, and in doing so, they render the transformative work of the Spirit ineffective in their daily lives.
It is the tragedy of a life lived beneath one's spiritual privilege.
That's it. Paul is saying, I toiled to make you free adults, and you are choosing to be fearful children who still live under the management of a guardian.
In this intense theological argument about regression, it now just dissolves into an intensely personal and heartfelt plea. In verse 12, Paul shifts again, appealing to their past bond.
Yes, he says, Brethren, I beseech you, be as I am, for I am as ye are. Ye have not injured me at all.
This is Paul dropping the mantle of the stern theological professor and just coming in as the pleading brother.
Yeah.
It's an incredibly tender and emotional tone. That appeal, I beseech you, is a powerful, almost desperate request.
It is.
And that line, be as I am, for I am as ye are, it is just layered with irony, isn't it? It's a call to imitate freedom, but it highlights this dramatic reversal happening in Galatia.
It embodies the supreme irony of the whole heresy. I mean, think about Paul. He was born the very definition of a legalist, a blameless Jew, a Hebrew of Hebrews, fully qualified under the law. He had every religious and cultural right to remain under that system.
But he didn't?
For the sake of the gospel and to reach the Gentiles, he intentionally became as a Gentile. He shed those cultural and ceremonial prerogatives to live solely by grace and freedom. As he writes in 1 Corinthians chapter 9, verse 21, he became as without law, but under the law of Christ.
So the paradox is crystal clear. Paul the Jew abandoned the law to experience grace and freedom so that the Gentiles could be free.
And now, these same Gentiles are trying to adopt the very legal yoke the apostle had just cast off.
So he's asking them to embrace the freedom he adopted on their behalf.
I chose freedom for you, he's pleading, so you must choose that freedom for yourselves. And that assurance, ye have not injured me at all, that's necessary. He's confirming that his anxiety is purely pastoral. They haven't wronged his dignity. They are destroying their own spiritual lives by abandoning grace.
And this open heart allows him to reminisce about the bizarre circumstances of their initial meeting, leading into this mystery of his physical condition in verses 13 and 14.
This is such a precious piece of biographical context. It really reveals Paul's humanity. He tells them he first preached the gospel to them initially through infirmity of the flesh, diesthenion. The illness wasn't just a backdrop to his visit.
It was the reason for it.
It was the occasion, the direct reason. He stopped and stayed in Galatia long enough to evangelize in the first place.
Now, the specifics of this infirmity, it's one of the New Testament's greatest unsolved medical mysteries. It's often connected to his thorn in the flesh. What are the leading theories that historians and scholars propose?
There are three prominent theories, and each one tries to account for the severity and the cultural response he describes. The first suggests malaria.
Okay.
Paul traveled through the lowlands of Pamphylia, which were notoriously swampy and malaria-ridden. Intense fevers would have forced him to seek higher, cooler, and healthier altitudes, like Pisidian Antioch in Galatia, to recover. And that led him to preach unexpectedly.
That accounts for the stop and the weakness. What's the second?
A second theory is epilepsy. This is partly because of the severe nature of the trial he describes, and because in the ancient world, epileptic fits were often associated with demons' possession being cursed, which would certainly be viewed as a trial or temptation by anyone watching.
And the third theory, which seems to gain the most strength from the textual evidence right here about his eyes.
That is the theory of ophthalmia, or a severe eye disease. This would be a painful, recurring infection, perhaps involving inflammation, discharge, or even temporary blindness. And it's often linked to the blinding light on the road to Damascus, which may have caused permanent or recurring damage.
So whichever affliction it was, Paul emphasizes that his condition was a profound temptation or trial to the Galatians. We have to understand the cultural context here. How did Greeks and Romans view a sick, suffering messenger?
With contempt and suspicion. In Hellenistic culture, outward appearance and physical perfection were highly, highly prized. Sickness, especially a chronic or visible one, was commonly interpreted as divine punishment, a sign that the gods had cursed or abandoned the person.
And Paul describes the cultural response he expected. He says they should have rejected him. He uses the word ektuo.
And the word ektuo is incredibly graphic. It literally means to spit out.
Wow, literally.
Yes. This wasn't just a metaphor for rejection. It was a common, literal cultural practice. If you encountered someone who was diseased or suffering an epileptic fit or was visibly afflicted, you would spit to ward off the evil eye, to deflect the bad omen and protect yourself from contamination. It was the ultimate physical sign of utter contempt and revulsion.
That makes the Galatians' initial reception of him absolutely miraculous.
It does. They overcame this profound cultural revulsion and superstition.
I saw this sick, broken, visibly suffering man, perhaps with a repulsive condition, and they didn't spit him out.
No. They received him as an angel of God, even as Christ Jesus. They demonstrated a supernatural ability to discern the value of the message over the aesthetics or physical prowess of the messenger. They understood that the power of the gospel was totally separate from the messenger's brokenness.
So Paul is reminding them of the purity of their first love, a love that saw past physical flaw and embraced the divine message.
And that memory makes their current shift so heartbreaking, leading Paul to lament in verse 15, "Where is then the blessedness you spake of?"
So what does he mean by blessedness? Is it just happiness?
It's deeper than that. It refers to that deep, satisfied happiness, that unshakable joy and self-congratulation you feel when you know your sin is forgiven, your status is secure, and your acceptance is guaranteed through a finished work.
And legalism is a joy killer.
It's the ultimate joy killer because it replaces that rest and satisfaction with the anxiety of a never-ending religious task. The happiness they found in the certainty of grace has been chilled and replaced by the worry of performance.
And he backs us up with the most vivid physical testimony of their former devotion. He says, "If it had been possible, you would have plucked out your own eyes and have given them to me."
This idiom is so vital. It's powerful rhetorical proof of their deep sacrificial love. And critically, it is the strongest piece of internal textual evidence supporting that ophthalmia theory.
Right. Why would he use eye plucking as the superlative example of their sacrifice, unless his own eyes were the site of his deepest pain and trial?
Exactly. It implies they would have literally engaged in agonizing sacrificial self-harm to alleviate his suffering. But now their love is so cold, they treat him as an enemy.
The reversal is just complete. Legalism has not only murdered their joy in Christ, but has also chilled their affection for the man who delivered the good news.
Which leads to the painful question in verse 16. Am I therefore become your enemy because I tell you the truth?
The angel of God is now the enemy. Why the absolute reversal? What happened?
The Judaizers had successfully reframed Paul. They painted him as a dangerous, anti-religious radical who opposes the heritage of Moses.
And because Paul refuses to compromise the message of radical, unmerited grace.
He threatens the stability of their performance-based system. Truth often alienates those who have found a perverse comfort or a sense of superiority in the lie of external ritual. When people are comfortable in their self-justification, the person who exposes that system is automatically seen as a threat to their self-identity and security.
So, having demonstrated the Galatians' foolishness in his own heartfelt love, Paul now turns his laser focus onto the root cause, the manipulative false teachers.
Yes, he exposes the psychology behind legalism in verse 17. They zealously affect you, but not well. Yeah, they would exclude you, that ye might affect them.
That phrase, zealously affect, it suggests intense courtship or flattery. The Judaizers aren't leading with theological debate. They're leading with manipulative attention.
Exactly. They are aggressively seeking the Galatians' favor, lavishing them with attention, with promises of a higher spiritual life and a deeper connection to God's ancient covenant. This is classic love bombing designed to gain trust and influence rapidly.
But Paul adds that crucial qualifier, but not well.
Their underlying intent is malicious, controlling, and entirely self-serving.
And their ultimate chilling intent is revealed by the phrase, they would exclude you. The Greek word there, ekklesai, means to shut out or lock out.
This is the cultic tactic of isolation and gatekeeping. The false teachers were telling the Galatians they were not complete, that they were outside the true circle of God's covenant. They weren't real Christians unless they submitted to circumcision and the full law.
It's the spiritual equivalent of showing up to a party only to be told the real party is upstairs and requires an entry fee that only they can collect.
Perfect analogy. And that must have created intense spiritual anxiety among these new converts. If you are excluded, you become desperate for the approval you need to get back in.
And that desperation is the engine driving the manipulative power play.
And the real goal is stated right there, that ye might affect them. The false teachers wanted the converts to become desperately anxious for human approval, specifically the approval of the Judaizers and the Jewish hierarchy they represented.
So their entire system is designed to create dependency on human leaders rather than total sufficiency in Christ. They aren't selling salvation, they're selling supervision.
Precisely. They are selling a path to acceptance that only they can supervise, manage, and ultimately revoke. This is the perfect definition of spiritual manipulation. True Christian leadership points you to Christ and freedom. False leadership points you to the leader and dependency.
And if we connect this to the modern picture, we see that dynamic play out in any system where spiritual authority is centralized in a human leader who defines the boundaries of purity or righteousness and then uses those boundaries to control behavior.
Any system that says, to be truly acceptable, you must adhere to my specific non-biblical code or join my exclusive group, is operating on the principle of ekklesai. It builds a following dependent on the leader's presence and approval, not sons who are free in Christ.
And Paul immediately contrasts this with genuine devotion in verse 18.
Yes. But it is good to be zealously affected, always in a good thing. The distinction is vital. True zeal is directed toward the betterment and freedom of the follower, even when the minister is absent. False zeal is directed toward making the follower dependent on the leader's presence and approval.
Having exposed the enemies without, Paul closes this section by returning to the deepest vulnerability of his heart in verse 19. This is really the emotional climax of the whole letter.
It really is. My little children, of whom I travail in birth again until Christ be formed in you.
The address, my little children, teknia, it's a rare term of intense, almost parental endearment. He's using it for an entire church community. It shows his paternal, deep affection and his feeling of profound responsibility for them.
And that responsibility leads him to this powerful maternal metaphor. Paul shifts genders, comparing himself to a mother in the agony of labor, didunu. But we have to note the word. He travails in birth again.
This is such a startling concept. He already labored once to bring them to the new birth to justification through faith. What does a second labor imply?
It means Paul is not suffering the agony of labor for their initial salvation again. He is suffering the agonizing pain of labor a second time, not for their justification, but for their restoration to the truth and for their spiritual maturity after their regression.
It's the agonizing pain of watching an adopted son voluntarily put himself back up for sale.
Yes. Paul is agonizing to bring them out of the slavery of performance and into the reality of their sonship, to see them live like the free people they already are.
And the end goal of this suffering defines the entire purpose of Paul's ministry. He labors until Christ be formed in you.
This is arguably the definitive statement on the goal of discipleship in the entire Bible. The word formed is morphu, which refers to the essential nature or the underlying reality taking shape. It speaks of a deep, internal, fundamental change of character. The goal is not behavior modification or external rule following.
Okay, so this is where we need to dive into the technical depth. Paul uses morphu, but there's another Greek word, schema, that refers to external appearance. What is the difference between Christ being formed in us and merely taking on a Christian shape?
That distinction is absolutely critical. Schema refers to the outward, external, superficial shape or appearance, the pattern you assume that can change quickly, like the cut of your clothes or the style of your hair.
What the legalists wanted.
Exactly. The legalists wanted to form the law in them. The external rules, specific calendars, diet as a scaffolding for performance, which is shema.
Like putting on a uniform that doesn't change the person inside.
Exactly. But Paul demands morpho. This is a radical internal transformation where the very life, character, and image of Jesus Christ, his essential reality, becomes the underlying structure of their souls.
It's the difference between an external scaffolding that eventually falls away and an internal, eternal skeleton of new life.
That's a great way to put it. Ministry is successful only when Christ becomes the foundational reality, the permanent form of the believer's existence.
And we see Paul use that contrast elsewhere, right? In Romans chapter 12, verse 2, he tells believers not to be conformed, which is schematige, to this world, but to be transformed, metamorpho.
Yes, the parallel is perfect. Stop taking on the external fleeting pattern of the world, which includes the world system of legalistic performance, and instead embrace the deep, radical, internal transformation that creates the essential character of Christ within you. His agony is focused on this ultimate goal of maturity.
And this deep spiritual travail leads to the final heart-wrenching sigh of this section in verse 20, where Paul admits his sheer frustration and human limitation.
Yes, I desire to be present with you now and to change my voice, for I stand in doubt of you.
This is a classic moment of profound pastoral vulnerability. Paul recognizes the inherent harshness and the uncompromising nature of a written letter. It lacks the nuance, the empathy, the ability to gauge a real-time reaction that a face-to-face conversation provides.
He wishes desperately he could change his tone, soften his voice, and adjust his approach based on their immediate response.
He wants to modulate the pitch to make sure the message hits home without unnecessarily bruising their tender spirits. But he's stuck communicating across distance and time. But what is the meaning of that final admission? I stand in doubt of you.
The Greek word is aporiomai. It literally means to be at a loss, without a way out, or perplexed.
Oh, he's stumped.
He is admitting that he is genuinely baffled, stumped by their foolishness. He is not saying he doubts their salvation, but he doubts their sanity. He is telling them and us that even an apostle endowed with divine insight can be perplexed by the sheer, stubborn foolishness of those who wander from the clear, glorious path of grace back into self-imposed bondage.
That moment of vulnerability, that admission of human helplessness in the face of spiritual regression is so powerful. It shows that freedom requires a constant choice.
It does. Even after being shown the glorious truth of sonship, people can actively choose the anxiety of the slave quarters. It is the ultimate testament to the reality of free will and the deep spiritual gravitational pull toward trying to achieve what has already been perfectly given.
This has been a deeply moving and intensely detailed analysis of Galatians chapter 4, verses 8 through 20. It's moved us from high theology to profound pastoral heartbreak. Let's try and synthesize the core warning Paul wants imprinted on our memory.
The core warning is singular and profound. Legalism, whether it's rooted in ancient law or in modern self-help systems, is regression, not spiritual growth. It is a deliberate retreat from the adult status of sonship back to the weak and beggarly principles of performance.
True spirituality is rooted entirely in the finished work of Christ and the objective reality of grace, not in keeping an external checklist.
Exactly. And Paul's model of ministry shines through as the antidote. It is a ministry defined by agony and love, focusing entirely on one outcome, seeing Christ formed, the internal nature of Jesus in people.
Which stands in sharp contrast to the manipulative legalists.
Absolutely. Paul did not seek popularity or dependency. He was willing to be treated as an enemy to tell the liberating truth. We have to heed his warning against leaders or systems that use exclusion, flattery, or demanding performance standards to build a following that's dependent on them for approval.
We always have to check our motivations. Are we pointing people to their total sufficiency in Christ or to their dependency on human systems?
It's the essential question. The dynamic of this passage forces us to re-examine our own relationship with freedom every single day.
And that leads to the final provocative thought we should wrestle with.
I think so. We all experience a powerful spiritual gravitational pull. The forces of human achievement, of needing to prove our worth, of ritualistic dependency, they are relentless. The question for all of us is this. How do we ensure that in our daily walk we were not subtly, perhaps unconsciously, substituting the joy and rest of a finished work, the definition of grace, for the endless anxiety of a never-ending task, the definition of law?
Because by choosing performance over the person of Christ,
we risk breaking the heart of the apostle by returning to the shadows we were rescued from. We must stand fast in the liberty of the Son.